All right, we're back today with a positive lesson after a few disappointing or kind of depressing ones. But first, a few of your awesome species of the day. We have the fuzzy little round chinchilla here. They weigh about 2 to 3 pounds. Super thick fur. They can have 50 hairs growing from a single follicle, and a square centimeter can have 20,000 hairs. Pretty amazing, pretty darn cute. We also have the common genet, I believe. It's an omnivore. They live in captivity for up to 20 years. They're fully nocturnal, and I'm very interested in this idea that they communicate through smell and body language. We've got the giant panda, native to South Central China, 20 years in the wild. As adults, they don't really have any predators, but babies are definitely at risk. Cute video here. Get that little guy hiding behind the tree. And then the red panda, slightly larger than a cat. Sorry, Gizmo, my little cat sitting next to me, looking at me. They spend most of their lives in trees. They're very active at night. They're kind of like a mixture between a panda and a raccoon. Um, Look at that little guy showing off. So today, as I said, we're talking about positive things. Specifically, we're talking about wildlife restoration. What can we do to put nature back together to undo some of the wrongs that humans have left on the world that impact wildlife? So I'm excited to talk about a positive topic. So what is wildlife restoration? It's an attempt to recover the abundance of species, the different dynamics and ecological interactions of wildlife that persisted prior to human impact. It's actively managing ecosystems and communities, directly manipulating things, not just changing like carbon dioxide emissions, but actually improving, changing, restoring things in the environment or animals themselves and population numbers. So, an obvious challenge with that is if we want to restore it before humans impacted, it's hard to figure out what were the exact conditions before human influence. We use different things like historical references. We look at kind of what we consider current pristine systems and try to get some of those characteristics when we're going for restoration. And we just do our best guess based on what we know about an animal and the ecosystem that it seems to be functioning in and try to restore that. So we're going to keep coming back to this slide tonight. We're going to talk about the biggest tools of wildlife restoration being relocation, habitat improvement, and then reestablishment of relationships with other species. So we'll talk about all of these at length. So first, relocation. Relocation is when we intentionally move an animal or a population of animals from one place to another. We can do this through translocation, which is when we move wild animals from one part of their natural range to another, maybe because they're on the edge of their range near a city and they're having conflict with humans, move them over a little deeper into their range where they're less likely to come over and have that conflict. We can reintroduce animals as a wildlife relocation technique, where you take a species that used to be living there, it was extirpated, which basically means completely removed or extinct from the area, but not actually extinct as a species. So you find a habitat where they used to live, and you can reintroduce animals there that used to live there in the past, or through supplementation, which is literally adding extra individuals to an existing population. So oftentimes that might involve captive breeding to get a diverse genetic information. What's the word I'm looking for? But just diverse genetics back into that population. So if they find that a area of mountain lions are all very highly related, we could be breeding some mountain lions with different characteristics or slightly different genetic compositions, put them into that population and hope that they mix to make a more diverse population. An example, a case study, this is a big one, is of relocation is the pygmy rabbit. So the pygmy rabbit is the smallest rabbit in North America. It digs its own burrows and has a very short breeding season, so it can be sensitive to different challenges and struggles. And they are super dependent. 99% of their diet in the winter is on sagebrush. So sagebrush is used as their diet. It's used for them to hide under, and they burrow around the roots of this plant. So if this plant is not prolific in the area, if there's clearing of it, or if it's overrun by invasive plants that take over, they can get very sensitive to that loss of habitat, and or fragmentation as the sagebrush that would typically cover whole areas kind of gets choked out by other invasive plants. So here are areas where the pygmy rabbit lives. And so specifically, we're going to look at the example of where they were in Washington, in the Columbia Basin. And so there was a population of the pygmy rabbits that lived there. But by 2001, scientists believe there were fewer than 30 in the wild in Washington. So they took 16 of them from the wild and immediately began a captive breeding program, trying to make sure all the offspring survived and grow the numbers in order to reintroduce. So by 3 years later, we had already removed 16. The remaining 14 didn't do well with their offspring, and the wild population was completely gone in Washington. So in 2007, after doing that captive breeding program, we tried to reintroduce pygmy rabbits back into the system. Unfortunately, none of the 20 animals that were released from the breeding program survived beyond a year. So it became a collaborative recovery effort. The Oregon Zoo worked closely with the Washington State University, Northwest Trek Wildlife Park, USFWS, and some other state wildlife agencies. And basically the plan was they were going to get wild pygmy rabbits from that other region that you saw on the map that was lower. And they were going to try to increase genetic diversity and increase numbers and continue to work on the breeding program. And they shifted the breeding program to be in semi-wild conditions. They were not being bred like indoors in a building. They're bred kind of in an environment that would be very similar to the one that they would be released to. And when they did the release this time, instead of just releasing juvenile offspring, that they also released some adult wild-caught pygmy rabbits. So again, that this benefited the situation in two ways. First of all, there was increased genetic diversity, and secondly, the adult rabbits were wild caught, so they were used to completely surviving on their own, and that had that experience and that previous success that the captive bred ones did not have. So you might be sitting here thinking, why do we care so much about restoring pygmy rabbits, especially if it's considered a low concern priority from the IUCN list? And the answer is, they can totally affect the land and the plants that live on it. So something has to be done. So restoration of the rabbits actually helped restore the environment and vice versa. So having some rabbits back, putting those bred ones and wild caught ones back in, helped restore the environment and help keep that land natural in the way that it should be. Specifically in a shrub steppe kind of formation. So it's this kind of landscape that we have that isn't forested. It's usually a couple layers of grasses and then shrubs such as the sagebrush, which they really like. So this is now the area where the pygmy rabbit could potentially be doing well. But as we see, as the population, the shrub steppe kind of disappeared with invasives, it became harder for them. So scientists looked into restoring the landscape, which also helped the animals. And what they found was this helped lots of sagebrush obligate species, which means species that depend on sagebrush, and also other species that don't, came back better when there was that combined effort of both protecting the rabbits and the land. And so they found sage grouse, sage sparrows, sagebrush lizards, all these ones that kind of lived in and around and through the sagebrush came back with that. Hawks, snakes, owls, all did better. They kind of managed the land, and as a result, deer, elk, and bighorn sheep moved in with bigger numbers because they were able to access the bushes and shrubs that they usually ate. So it's one of those things where, yes, there was a focus on a single animal, but by improving the landscape and helping that animal survive, it improved the landscape further, which has a cascading effect on all these other wildlife. So another aspect of wildlife restoration is wildlife habitat improvement. We know if wildlife populations decline because of degradation to a habitat, that we need to restore that habitat. And this can be through reforesting an area. It can be replacing invasive species with native plants like they did with the sagebrush. It can be reestablishing wetlands and looking at the hydrology and the flow of water in a certain area and how that affects different organisms. So a great example of restoring amphibians just came through the basics of creating more ponds. So the fire-bellied toad, Bombina bombina, basically successfully breeds in temporary ponds. So they use permanent ponds for eating and foraging for food, but they do their breeding in temporary ponds where there aren't the bigger predators because it's not a pond that lasts all year long. So they're dependent on the fact that these temporary ponds exist, and they exist for long enough for successful breeding. And they also need to be near permanent ponds where they can find their food for long-term survival. So in these ones that live in Denmark need to have temporary ponds that remain wet until at least August. Otherwise, the breeding cycle does not complete. And the temporary ponds that support fire-bellied toads are also used by other amphibian species. So again, an attempt to look at what these fire-bellied toads need ended up having a cascading positive effect for other amphibian species as well. So they looked at what was happening and why these were struggling, and they found that pond drainage in Denmark became a really popular thing. People were basically draining their ponds to have more arable land and land for building and things like that. So by 1988, the species of these toads naturally was down to only about 3 small populations. So the government worked with private landowners and convinced them and paid them and gave them incentives to create ponds on their land. So we got about 70 ponds in a 10-year period. And what they saw was these were the numbers, and they estimated these by the ones with the lines. They estimated by how many males were making calls. The white ones they estimated by capturing and then trying to recapture and see how many they could find. Again, different strategies during different time periods. But what we could see with this information is that the number were declining of adults as the ponds were being drained. And then in the 10-year period and years following after they did reintroduce those ponds, the numbers basically rose with some variation from year to year, which could be blamed on different circumstances other than the ponds. So wildlife habitat improvement can also be achieved through changing the structure of the landscape. And so specifically here, we're talking about building corridors or safe passageways for animals to travel from one fragmented habitat to another, and also removing barriers to movement from areas where they are living to where areas they aren't. And that could be as simple as removing a fence, depending on the creature. So here's an example, though, of the Trans-Canada Highway overpass. They built this big road, and it obviously transects some pretty important habitat. You could see water and mountains and forests, and then forests separated from that. And so this created a problem for animals trying to safely cross. And so this is a really easy, maybe, I don't know if it's easy, but kind of basic idea that provides a much safer way for animals to travel across the highway. They also used wildlife fencing on the side, so you can't just build the bridge and expect they're all just going to walk along in the forest to the bridge. So they combined the bridge with wildlife fencing, and so the fencing was designed to stop the larger animals that you don't want to get hit by cars, with the idea that they walk along the fence and then they will find the 6 wildlife overpasses. They also built 38 underpasses, which we'll see images of what underpasses look like in a little bit. So what they found was the animals were indeed using the wildlife crossings. Over 140,000 documented wildlife crossings in about a 15-year period. So they knew that it was working. This effort was helpful, and this is just what was caught or documented. Obviously, they were using it probably in much higher frequency. So here's another example of one in the Netherlands. Again, they have the overpass to make it safe for animals crossing with fences that you just can't see in this picture. Here's an example of an underpass. This is salamanders. If you can see these little black guys with the yellow dots, you can see a couple of them right here. It's a smaller version of this guy. These were really cool. Basically, these salamanders, their eggs hatch quickly, and the larvae develop very quickly into young adults, and then they emerge and they need to migrate from their ponds back to the forest. And so they have to travel from one location far to another, and little salamanders crossing the road is not going to work out very well for them, especially when they're doing it in high numbers. So these underpasses are really good options for them. Kind of cool. Here's an example right here of an underpass under a road. You might not even realize it's there if you're driving over it. But a cool fact is that if salamanders were to like crawl up it, which they could accidentally do, the angle, I believe, of the lip right here prevents them from actually climbing over. So then they'll go back down and find a different way. So there's sort of natural features built into these that are intentional for the animals they're trying to support. Elephants. Let's talk about elephants again. So, in Angola, over 100,000 elephants were slaughtered during war. Less than 40 were left by 2001, while the surrounding countries still had very healthy elephant populations. So, these elephants needed some help. And so, Angola's right here. You can see the surrounding countries. And so, what they did is these different countries got together and they made this conservation area, which allowed the elephants from the different areas to sort of have a protected area and to be able to interbreed a little bit more. So the area itself is 150,000 square miles. It's the largest conservation project in the world. It's pretty cool. By early 2012, they found 8,000 elephants in Angola. So the numbers were really increasing. They attribute this to the interconnected system of reserves and corridors where the elephants can travel very freely and interact with each other and access different resources and all of those things instead of being kind of trapped and surrounded by war and limited. A cool thing about this area is that it increased tourism by a lot. Predicted numbers was that maybe even tenfold would be the increase they would see. It's a great collaborative effort from 5 different nations. Like we talked about with ecotourism, it benefits the local communities, and was based on conservation design in Namibia. So Namibia, which gained independence in 1990, actually had their own conservation is written into their constitution. So community-based conservation groups is sort of a way of life there. And it became a great success story, and their success stories continue to spread conservancies and the ability or the idea of conserving land for wildlife throughout of Africa. Right now, there's 71 different conservancies registered, and they provide jobs for local people and make a lot of money for the country as well, allowing more and more land to be protected as it becomes more profitable. Something else we can do to help wildlife and habitat is to restore what's happening with natural disturbances. So, like if human management of a forest is causing more fires, or if cutting down trees is causing wind throw, trees damaged by wind because the natural barriers are gone, or flooding again because of anthropogenic purposes, like we need to go back and fix that and improve the habitat itself that the wildlife is living in. So there's a story here about restoring the Oak Creek forest that you can watch. So again, we've talked about relocation, we've talked about habitat improvement, and now we're going to talk about reestablishing pre-existing wildlife relationships. So animals that would have interacted with animals previously in the natural environment before humans. So sometimes wildlife populations of one species could decline because another species has either shot out of control or declined as well. And so we know that animal populations can decline if they are losing their food source of another animal, or if there's too much competition, or due to parasites, or even predators. Oftentimes invasive predators have been released that impact them negatively. So it's important to find that right pre-existing relationship between even the animals and even the plants that exist in that area, and get rid of and control those enemies that kind of weren't the natural way. So predators are often thought of as agents of mortality. They're going to kill off the animals. But what we've actually found is it can be really helpful sometimes to restore wildlife populations. They say restoration with teeth because we're restoring it with predators. If you find the right predators that belong there, they can actually help even out the system. I know well, we'll get there. So predators are important because they can suppress herbivore numbers. If there's way too many deer eating all the plants in the area, no, but they're not going to be doing very well. You actually need predators of those deer to keep that population in check so that there is a healthy resource of the plants and the native fauna that should be, or flora that should be there. So sometimes if you have mesopredators taking over, which are the ones right below the top or the apex predators, if you add some top apex predators, they keep the mesopredators numbers a little bit lower, which also helps the animals that those mesopredators are eating, and so on. So apex being the top, meso being the next, and then there's probably an herbivore animal that is the prey of the mesopredators underneath them in those food webs. So again, it allows different animals to survive. It allows more equal, kind of stable numbers of different populations. Some examples, we've already talked about this when we've talked about, we didn't use this terminology, but if you remember, we talked about the dingoes being introduced in Australia to protect the landscape. And we talked about wolves in Yellowstone and how that helped with the water because the elk were eating all the trees down by the water and making the water not flow, and erosion problems and all kinds of things. So, just to review really quickly, the dingo is the only large terrestrial predator in Australia. They do prey on cattle sometimes, and so they are killed off in some areas to protect farmers' cattle. However, it is an apex predator and it can feed off of red foxes and feral cats, which sometimes eat rabbits, small kangaroos, emus, goats, and donkeys. And so when the apex predator is there, kind of managing all those numbers, it allows the smaller mammals to increase in abundance because there aren't as many red foxes and feral cats doing the hunting of those smaller animals. So it increases the vegetation cover and diversity in the area. These are some of those cute little carnivorous marsupials that you need in some numbers, and those numbers go very low when you don't have the dingoes. So the solution that Australia proposed and tried was to reintroduce the dingo to protect that native biodiversity. It's still controversial. Some people don't like it. And some people argue that the dingoes aren't actually controlling the numbers of the foxes and cats, but rather just the behavior of them. Either way, they're seeing some success with restoration because of this. And then again, the wolf reintroduction. In the 1920s, wolves were completely removed from Yellowstone National Park. But without them, the elk population soared. Elk eat the aspen. Aspen trees didn't do very well because they were all getting eaten by the elk. So the aspen trees affected the water and the flow and the creeks and the rivers. And so the wolves actually protect aspen. So having them be there means you can have a healthy aspen population because they eat the elk, they eat the aspen. Tree. So in 1995 to 97, wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone. They fed off of elk, and so elk populations decreased, and we saw plants begin to recover. The beavers used the willow branches, which is one of those recovered plants, to build lodges. Beaver colonies have increased 8 times. More beaver ponds means more habitats for insects, more fish, more amphibians, more reptiles, birds, mammals, and even moose because they rely on those ponds that are built up by the beaver lodges. They also found that wolf kills the leftovers, feed other animals as well. Ravens, magpies, bald and golden eagles all benefit from it as well. So there's this group called the Defenders of Wildlife. They're a non-government funded private organization trying to shift that responsibility for wolf recovery away from the individual farmer. Basically, what that means is by reintroducing the wolves usually stayed in the park, but also would sometimes kill farmers' cattle and other animals. This is why we got rid of them in the first place, farmers hunting them off because they were eating their livestock. And so it's not fair to, yes, it's healthy for that ecosystem to add them back in, but it's not fair for ranchers to bear the brunt of the cost of having all this lost livestock. So what the Defenders of Wildlife does is they pay for anything that the wolves eat, and so they fundraise and they compensate farmers for lost animals. And so you can see here in these different areas, this is animals they paid for wolf recovery, and 503 cattle in Greater Yellowstone, 932 sheep, 63 other animals. And they paid $500,000 for those animals to basically keep the ranchers happy and leaving the wolves alone, even though the wolves were taking some of their livestock. Another example of species interaction that's important is one on the Finnish archipelago. In this area, it's a pretty simple ecological communities, but they're ones that were very sensitive to pollution and invasive species, especially on all these little islands and land masses that you see here on the edge. And so, what they found here is that an invasive species, the American mink, came in. And what it did was it reduced the numbers of certain types of birds, frogs, and voles, which increased the amount of plants that were happening there. Wait, hold on. It decreased this. Oh, and when it decreased this, it decreased the plants. And so what scientists realized was that voles being in and eating and interacting with these plants actually helped the diversity. And so the lack of the voles, which eat those plants, actually led to a lack of the plants. So the mink came in, voracious eater, and it impacted the plants. And the plants were less diverse because the mink was there eating the voles. Um, So the mink is considered a mesopredator, though. It isn't technically the highest one on the food chain. And so scientists were like, hold up, why is this mink coming in? And it's a mesopredator. There should be an apex predator that eats the mink, and nothing seems to be happening. So they looked into it. And it turned out, well, the apex predator for mink is the white-tailed sea eagle. And we learned about DDT and PCBs and how hard those were on bird raptor populations. And so now that the numbers of that are recovering with the lack of DDT being used in that area, the sea eagles are kind of reclaiming the area and able to eat the American mink. The mink has altered its behavior to avoid having interactions with the sea eagle. But we also think that the sea eagles are beginning to minimize the mink impacts on the native species. So they're acting differently. They're not doing as well. And they are kind of bringing the environment back to where it was. Another example is the snow leopards and the Himalayan tahr, which is this guy right here. The snow leopards were completely removed from Sagarmath National Park in Nepal. After years of protection, they recolonized the area. And so they're eating those tahr goats that we saw in cattle. And so scientists were looking at, well, what is the implication of them coming back in and doing that? And this is where we get into the Pleistocene rewilding theory. The Pleistocene was a time period. Basically, that was the time period where all the major extinction of large bodied North American animals just disappeared. And so, for whatever reason that happened, there's a lot of different ideas, but basically, all the large bodied American mammals left. So, in the Pleistocene time, you would have found herds of mammoths walking around and all types of sort of big, slow mammals that had not evolved around any type of predators. So the main theory is that humans came in about in that time period and started hunting, and there were these big packs of slow, not hesitant animals, and they were very easy to take down. And so our Earth used to have mammals like Africa has not our Earth, but our continent used to have mammals. Like Africa has elephants, and it used to have big cats, and it used to have all different types of these large mammals that we lost. And so the Pleistocene rewilding theory says, well, what if we did our best to make that happen again? What if then we might really know what the ecosystems should be like or would have been like in the wild? And so there are people who have ideas like we should bring elephants back. Probably the landscape of North America used to look like the savanna that you see in Africa. If it had had these different types of animals, the land and the flora itself would have been very different. So it's an idea. Most people think it's not very feasible, quite crazy. Maybe it's genius though. There's a lot of talks about the pros and cons of trying to see what our land really would look like. Just like wolf reintroduction wasn't popular, it benefited the environment in the end. A lot of people were worried about the cattle and didn't realize the impact it would have on so many other aspects of the ecosystem. And so the argument by people into the rewilding theory as well. We don't really know what would happen until we try it. So there's been talks of, well, what if we took fenced reserves and just put these animals back in and allowed ecosystem dynamics to play out? Would areas of our country look the way it does now, like a desert, like in the Southwest and in Arizona, or would it look more like the savannas that we have in Brazil? And the answer is we won't know unless we try it. So try Googling rewilding theory and see what you can come up with. That's all I've got for today. I hope you guys are all staying safe and healthy, and I miss ya.